Hi, I'm JL Mulvihill. A lot of people know me as Jen. I write books. I write a lot of young adult books, but I also write thrillers and chillers and scary, spooky things. Today I'm going to read you a story called Chilled Meat. It is from The Dreams of Steam 2, which is from the Brass and Bolts. It's a very pretty picture. I'm not sure if you can read the words. To me, it looks backwards when I look at it at the camera, but maybe you can see it right. Anyway, there's a lot of great stories in here. If you're not familiar with steampunk, then perhaps you'd like to pick this book up. It'll give you an idea of what steampunk is. I'm going to attempt to read this story without messing it up too terribly, and we'll see how things go. Lilla superfluously smoothed her skirt down before walking to the entrance of the building. As the porter opened the door for her, his enthusiastic smile faltered when he became aware of her morning dress and weeping veil. A stern, stalking older gentleman who looked every bit a lawyer greeted Lilla in the foyer. He introduced himself as Mr. Gibbs and escorted her to a well-furnished office on the first floor, where she found her stepdaughter, Catherine, seated along with a friend and consort. Also present were several other attorneys, very similar to Mr. Gibbs in appearance. "Now that Mrs. Edwards is here, we can proceed with the reading of the will," announced Mr. Gibbs. Catherine, a short, pudgy girl with a dirty blonde hair and a face that looked like she had eaten sour lemons her entire life, turned and glared at Lilla as she came into the room. Lilla ignored her and busied herself by pulling off her veil before sitting in the chair offered her by Mr. Gibbs. She kept her face blank as the reading began, yet attentive in appearance. Catherine would now and again throw Lilla a contemptuous look, but Lilla remained placid. When at last the formalities of the verbose rhetoric usually inserted at the beginning of a will, Mr. Gibbs finally read, "And to my lovely bride I leave my entire estate, minus the modest dowry and the month pension my daughter Catherine will receive until she marries." A disgruntled sound came from Catherine across the room, but Lilla paid no mind to it, for she at last had heard what she had been waiting for. The bothersome old Mr. Thompson Edwards had left her everything. Lilla wouldn't worry over a little pension or a dowry. Let the stupid girl have her money. Lilla snuck a peek over at Catherine, who glared in turn at her with hatred in her eyes. Catherine had recently turned 23 and stood to be an old maid if she didn't marry soon. Lilla didn't really care at this point. She had been married 6 times now, but to a girl of Catherine's stature it wasn't right for her not to be married by now. "You can't let her have my father's money," Catherine suddenly stood up and yelled. "She married him for his money. Can't you see that?" "Catherine, you don't know what you're saying. You're distraught," said her consort, a healthy, handsome, and young man with blonde, shoulder-length hair and brilliant blue eyes. Lilla saw that he stood by Catherine's side the whole time, but when Catherine seemed distracted, his eyes strayed hungrily to Lilla. "Yes, of course you're upset," said Mr. Gibbs. "I'm sure you don't mean to imply these things of your stepmother." "Don't call her that. She isn't my mother in any way, shape, or form. She's a witch, and she killed my father," Catherine spat. "No, please, Catherine. I know you don't mean this," said Lilla, at last standing to her own defense. "I loved your father, and I miss him terribly, just as much as you do." "You lie!" Catherine yelled. This time her ladylike mannerisms vanished in the midst of her anger. "Mr. Gibbs, I think I need to leave, please. I don't feel very well," said Lilla as she wobbled a bit. Mr. Gibbs ran immediately to her side to steady her. "Oh, Mr. Gibbs, thank you," Lilla said, dabbing her face with her handkerchief. "I understand she's distraught with grief, but I'm worried." I'm worried about Catherine. I fear, Mr. Gibbs, that her health is in danger, Lilla said as Mr. Gibbs escorted Lilla out of the room. What do you mean, Mrs. Edwards? Miss Catherine seems like a healthy young lady to me. I think she'll be okay, said Mr. Gibbs as he patted Lilla on the back. What I mean is, said Lilla, she moved out of the house because she saw her father's ghost. I pretend to understand what she continued to go on about the day she left, except that she swore she saw her father walking the hallways and could not bear to be in the house a second longer. After that, she just left, stated Lilla, matter of fact. Well, Mrs. Edwards, this is the first news I've heard of this, said Mr. Gibbs. Of course it is. The poor dear is embarrassed. Now she has conjured up this wild story that I've murdered her father. That is just ridiculous, as seeing ghosts in the house, and it's just a bit too much for me to deal with. I am just as upset as she is. I mean, I know that Thomas is her father, but he was my husband too, and I loved him dearly. Otherwise, I never would have married him, said Lilla. Of course you loved him, Mrs. Edwards, and he loved you just as much. Don't you worry about Miss Catherine. I will see to it that she's looked after by a physician immediately, said Mr. Gibbs. Now, please, Mrs. Edwards, go ahead and get some rest. We are finished here. I can bring by my necessary papers for you to sign later. I am sure this has been very tiring for you. Oh, thank you, Mr. Gibbs. You don't know how much I appreciate your help with everything. You have been so kind to me and my family, said Lilla. Mr. Gibbs excused himself and returned to his office. Lilla looked around and, seeing no one around, reached into her purse. She removed a small bottle and carefully poured some of its contents onto a part of her handkerchief. She used extreme care not to get any of the liquid on her skin. Lilla waited in the hallway, but she did not have to wait long before Catherine came rushing out of the attorney's office in anger, her friend and consort at her heels. Catherine, wait, Lilla said as she reached out and grabbed Catherine's wrist, the wet part of the handkerchief in her hand lightly touching Catherine's bare skin. Don't touch me, you murdering charlatan, Catherine spat. You may have everyone here fooled, but you and I both know who and what you are, and I will prove it if it's the last thing I do. With that, Catherine spun away from Lilla, pulling her wrist from Lilla's grip, her skirt swishing and swirling as she turned. Her wrist had a burning sensation, and she touched it with her other hand, rubbing it to ease the pain. She hadn't realized that her stepmother had such a strong grip. Lilla followed Catherine out of the building and watched as she got into a carriage that stood on the opposite side of the street. Lilla left, taking her own carriage that stood waiting for her. As she headed home, she contemplated her next move. She knew for sure that she would have no more trouble from Catherine, and her accusations by the time she had come... She knew for sure she would have no more trouble from Catherine and her accusations, but the time had come for Lilla to leave Huntsville. She would have to make preparations to leave, including the liquidation of Mr. Thomas Edwards' estate. Excuse me. 4 months later, Lilla found herself able to leave Huntsville at last. She had wanted to leave sooner, but found it more difficult than usual to settle her husband's estate. Catherine had suddenly suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be committed. Lilla managed to convince the attorneys and accountants that she would need Catherine's finances, turned over to her for the long term to keep Catherine in the asylum comfortably. Lilla saw no other way to get her money without raising suspicion on herself. After all, death and madness followed Lilla like a secret friend. Lilla boarded the western train bound for Memphis. The gleaming iron dragon sat upon a massive drive wheels astride the metal rails, its towering smokestacks secreting the slightest wisp of breath in anticipation. Several men ran around wiping the outside of its cylinder body, while others checked the sandpit, loaded coal and wood, and filled the water tank. Like a well-oiled machine themselves, the men scurried about their jobs in record time. Once the train set out on its course, Lilla endured the 12-hour ride within the comforts of a private car only wealthy passengers would be willing to pay for. A chaise lounge, 2 high-backed chairs, and a table graced a small room with 2 large windows and a very small water closet. A rope on the wall connected to a bell somewhere in the train that, when rung, would summon a black-haired girl with dark eyes, not much older than herself, to attend to Lilla's every need. Though the car offered all the comforts afforded to one with money, nothing short of opening the windows could alleviate the heat. When the train pulled into Calhoun Street Station in Memphis, Tennessee, Lilla could hear church bells chiming the 8th hour in the distance. A large cloud of smoke and steam rose into the air. The train whistle blew as if in answer to the church bells as the train came to a slow but jerky stop. The smell of burnt water and coal wafted through the open window and accosted Lilla's nostrils. Like a black widow molting, Lilla shed her morning attire and stepped into Calhoun Street Station wearing a turquoise dress with white lace and a short bustle. Lilla fancied this dress because the color went well with her porcelain skin and complemented her gray eyes. She also liked the way the dress sinfully accentuated her figure. Her white Gainsborough hat with matching plumes emphasized her raven hair that she had pulled up with short, loose ringlets down her neck. Lilla appeared fresh in her new skin. Lilla not only shed the attire of a widow in mourning, but also the name Lydia von Edwards, and became the respectable Miss Ilya Ledwill. Lilla went her last few months in Huntsville, creating and acquiring the proper paperwork for her new life, including letters of introduction. Over the years, Lilla had become a master at the art of becoming someone other than herself. Obtaining the paperwork for identification didn't present any difficulty, especially with the plague running rampant in certain parts of the country. It became fairly easy to obtain birth certificates of the deceased underclass as well as an identification number. Lilla maintained such a mask of deception, she almost forgot the real Lilla Lee Wild and the person she had once been. Her first husband had been an accident. She did marry him for his money, but never expected him to die so conveniently and so quickly. When Lilla inherited all his money and possessions, the idea began to set in. Lilla hated marriage, especially when the old men felt like they owned her and had the right to touch her. Not that any of them could really do anything with her, to her, or even for her. Lilla always made sure to marry old suitors. Lilla loved having the money, though, and a few months of marriage did not seem like too much to sacrifice for the things that she wanted. However, the last husband, Thomas Edwards, had been the worst marriage yet. Everything the old man did annoyed her, from the sound of his breathing to the way he slurped his soup and moaned if his potato tasted of caviar or some other sort of delicacy. Lilla chose to relocate to Memphis because of an announcement Mr. Edwards received in the mail one day. It stated that the esteemed Professor Art Messon would be celebrating his 80th birthday at the banquet hall at Southern University I think I skipped a page, in Memphis. Lilla's curiosity piqued when she read Dr. Art Messon's biography that had been included. It seemed that Dr. Messon, a professor of engineering, was a widower. Lilla considered this information for a few days until one evening, as she helped Mr. Thomas Edwards to bed like a dutiful wife, she showed him the announcement and inquired as to how Mr. Edwards knew Professor Messon. I'm not familiar with that, Frenchie, nor do I intend to be, said Mr. Edwards. I'm a Mason, of course. They're going to send me an invite. Of course, dear, Lilla said politely. I merely wondered why you being a Mason had anything to do with it. Ah, silly woman. How should you know? Women don't know about these things, said Mr. Edwards. Lilla had to bite her tongue, as she often had at these comments. She hated it when men treated her as if she were some kind of idiot. I know, but maybe you could see your way clear to enlighten this poor ignorant woman, said Lilla. Mr. Edwards studied her a moment, trying to decide if she was being uppity with him, or she truthfully wanted to know something about his life. He watched as she cleaned up the room and mixed his nightly tonic. Finally he answered her, curious to see where her interests lie. The Masons, which I am member of, as you remember, said Mr. Edwards. Yes, dear, said Lilla. She purposely looked intently into his dull brown eyes, knowing that her attention to him would please him. The Masons began that college back in 1850 in Clarksville, Tennessee. The Masons had a hand in a lot of ventures to help this country along, and if it weren't for the Masons, this darn country would not be what it is now. Heck, it was a Mason who discovered steam power and invented steam engines. You just remember that, said Mr. Edwards. His nightly tonic began to take effect. Lilla had made it extra strong tonight. Usually a nurse took care of Mr. Edwards in the evenings, but on her nights off Lilla would attend to him. Lilla gleaned what information she could get out of Mr. Edwards about Professor Messon. When she learned that Professor Messon had a lot of money and possible investments, Lilla made up her mind. As Mr. Edwards drifted off to sleep, Lilla quietly and in a practiced manner took a syringe with a very small needle and injected an air bubble into Mr. Edwards' vein, taking great care to stick the small needle into a convenient mole on his neck. She left quickly before Mr. Edwards suffered his fatal heart attack. Lilla stepped out from the train station into the busy city of Memphis. Steam carriages bustled back and forth, drivers and passengers alike dressed like dirigible pirates, wearing leather caps, goggles, and scarves wrapped around their necks, trailing with their laughter. Billows of steam rose up into the air, adding to the already humid environment. In the distance, Lilla could hear steamships announcing their arrival and departure at the docks. Factory smokestacks exhaled, adding to the atmospheric madness. It didn't take Miss Ilia Ledwell long to get established in Memphis. Introduced to the proper people and invited to Professor Messon's birthday party. After all, Lilla had a way with manipulating people into giving her what she wanted. As her profession for the last few years, Lilla also knew how to worm her way into society as if she had always been there. After inheriting the wealth of 6 husbands, Lilla had enough money to keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. She had accounts in several banks and lived in luxury wherever she went, staying in the finest establishments, eating at the finest restaurants, and wearing the finest clothes. Lilla planned to travel abroad after this one last time. She wanted to be sure she had enough money to keep her in comfort for the rest of her life, that she intended to live out abroad and maybe somewhere in England or Italy. Lilla didn't realize she had gone beyond the point of one last time, for it was the kill she craved. 4 husbands ago, she had said to herself this would be the last time. However, it hadn't been the last time, and Lilla now found herself planning to obtain husband number 7. Professor Art Messon turned out to be a thin, sickly old man in a wheelchair that he powered by a small version of a steam engine. Another brass contraption attached to the side of the wheelchair enabled the professor to continually breathe from an air ventilator. Professor Messon turned out to be the perfect victim, better than Lilla had hoped for. Not only was Professor Messon a widower and in poor health, but he did have a lot of money, more so than any of the other husbands Lilla had ever had. Lilla felt sure that once she had her charm in motion, Professor Messon would not be able to resist her. Struck by her charm and beauty, Professor Messon couldn't help but be drawn to the respectable Miss Ilia Ledwell. Her grace and kindness toward an old man comforted him and returned him to a youthful state. After the birthday party, Lilla found occasions to see the professor again and again, whether at a function of some sort or just to drop by for a visit. Soon the local gossips and who's who in Memphis took notice that Miss Ilia Ledwell had been spending quite a bit of time at Messon's estate. This startled no one due to the fact that Professor Messon had a charming and very handsome young nephew, Lucas Messon. Everyone came under assumption, including Lucas, that Miss Ilia had eyes for only Lucas, and so it shocked Lucas and the entire family when Professor Messon announced that he himself would be married to Miss Ilia. "Uncle, you can't go through with this," Lucas passionately advised one day. "You hardly know the young lady, and she is less than half your age, I'm sure." "I think you advised me on the grounds that you wish to have her for a wife yourself," said Professor Messon. "Don't try and deny it. I have seen the way you look at her like a hungry wolf. It's disgusting." "Uncle, I'm surprised at you and your insinuations of my intentions," said Lucas. "Oh, I know a young man's intentions, dear boy. Remember, I was once one too," said Professor Messon. "That is exactly why I am marrying her. She will make me feel young again. That, and to protect her from wolves such as yourself, who wouldn't know what to do with such a tender young thing in the first place." "But, Uncle, your age," persisted Lucas. "Age schmage. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. Now leave me be. I've plans to make," said Professor Messon. Lucas never said another word about it to his uncle. However, the rest of the family continued to protest until the professor insisted that no one would be allowed to speak to him of it again, lest they be written out of his will. Lilla, however, continued to receive a snide remark from time to time behind the professor's back. But that didn't bother her. On the contrary, Lilla had become used to this sort of treatment and handled it delicately and lightly as an innocent girl would. She knew never to confront or betray the animosity of the family members. Lilla didn't want anything to upset her plans. The day at last came, and Lilla walked the aisle of St. Mary's. Her ivory-colored silk and chiffon gown blended with the gold and blue hues of the vaulted ceiling and pillars of the cathedral. Adorning her raven silk braids, Lilla wore a crown of golden leaves, and the flow of the dress about her gave the impression of an angel. The professor looked upon her, knowing she would bring him to know the youthful days he once knew. At first, Lilla enjoyed her life as headmistress of Messon Manor. The 3-story high Second Empire-style home stood on the corner of Adams and North Orleans Street. A Gothic tower graced the front and center of the house, giving it the appearance of a castle. The home sat upon a low-lying hill, spread its charm across 2 acres of land, and included an English garden, grape arbor, and servant quarters, and a large carriage house. The house had been built for the home of a sea captain at one time, and then owned by a banker before Professor Messon acquired it and christened it the Messon Manor. Though this house had to be the most elegant one Lilla had ever lived in, she soon grew tired of the tedious day-to-day task of a wife held in her class. Not only did she have to attend to the affairs of the home, but she was also expected to hold and attend tea parties and functions for the upper society ladies. Determined to put an end to this quickly, she started to excuse herself from the functions on the grounds that her husband's health began to fail. True to her excuses, Professor Messon began to keep to his rooms more frequently, and Lilla grew hopeful that it would not be too long before she would be a widow again. Alas, poor Lilla found herself disappointed one evening when at dinner the butler announced that Professor Messon would be joining her. She could hardly contain her astonishment at how healthy and young her husband looked. It seemed to her that he looked 10 years younger and no longer accompanied by his breather. Lilla realized, with the slight excitement of a young schoolgirl, that she must help her poor dear ailing husband out of his misery before he got any healthier. Lilla decided she must attend to him that very evening. "My darling husband, you are looking so well and fit. Whatever have you done?" Lilla asked. "Oh, it seems my new medication agrees with me," he said. "That and the prospects of entertaining my new bride." He smiled a rather devilish smile that Lilla found extremely distasteful, but didn't show it. "I am feeling quite well. Perhaps you would care to join me in my room for brandy before bedtime?" the professor asked with a wink. Lilla smiled and turned her head as if a blushing bride, for they had only been married a mere 2 months and had yet to sleep in the same bed, considering her husband's age and health. "I think I should like that very much," she said. "Just let me attend to a few household duties first, and then I will join you." "Very well, then," he said. "Come, Hobbs, I have a date with my wife, and I must get ready." Hobbs wheeled the professor away. Professor Messon didn't use his steam-powered chair at home, but rather relied upon Hobbs or Lilla to push him around the house. Lilla retired to her room to obtain a few things she would need for the evening. She found her syringe where she had hidden it, safe within a cut-out indent of her favorite book that she kept on the shelf opposite her bed. The book, The Castle Otranto, had been Lilla's favorite since she had been a little girl, and she kept it with her always. Though it had pained her to cut away any part of the book, Lilla felt this to be the safest place to keep her tools. She also kept a little bottle of cyanide salts and a small bottle of laudanum that she hardly ever used anymore. Lilla wrapped the syringe carefully in her handkerchief, and she tucked it into her bustier and went to greet her husband for the last time. Professor Messon sat in the wheelchair, devouring her with his eyes as Lilla entered the room. Hobbs had just poured 2 glasses of brandy and left the two alone, closing the door behind him. "Shall we have a toast to us, my dear?" Professor Messon asked, gesturing to the glass sitting at a small table. The professor held his glass in the air, preparing for the toast. "Yes," said Lilla, picking up her glass. "To us," she said, taking a sip of the brandy. "Would you like to move to the balcony? It is such a lovely night tonight." Lilla took another sip of her brandy and walked to the double doors of the balcony and opened them to a full and perfect moon. The warm southern air entertained a cool breeze from the north, rustling through the trees along the way, and filled the air with the scent of magnolias, wisteria, and honeysuckle. Lilla took another sip of her brandy, then set the glass down. Her hands gripped the handles of the wheelchair to push her husband outside when she felt a strange sensation of falling and then blackness. When Lilla came to her senses, she felt very cold. Her body shivered, but only on the inside. Her body did not seem to move. Lilla's next feeling and realization was that she couldn't move her body at all, except she managed to open her eyes. A stone and brick ceiling loomed above her, very much like the stone and bricks that made up her home. In her peripheral vision, she could see the walls around her made of the same. To her right, Lilla saw a large wood-framed machine that she couldn't quite register. It stood almost as high as the ceiling and connected with brass pipes and glass tubes. A large wheel, bigger than a carriage wheel, spun in the middle of the machine, while a continuous droning and humming sound emitted from it. Lilla realized that she had heard the sound on quiet nights at the house, and thought the sound had come from the steamships on the river. This information instantly registered to her that though she could not be in her room or anywhere else she may recognize, she still must be somewhere in or near the house. Lilla remembered having brandy in the professor's room, and it had occurred to her that she must have been drugged. Denial set in. This couldn't be. She had to be the one in control. She had always been the one in control. She shouldn't be the one laying here helpless, unable to move. This disturbed her greatly, and she began to panic. She could still breathe, though. Her body wouldn't respond to her, though, it seemed. It was as if her lungs were still... It was as though her lungs still knew what to do, and they continued faster within her as panic grew, and as did her heart rate. "Ilya," spoke a voice from out of nowhere. The sound jolted her, and she tried to regain some composure, though it seemed that it wouldn't matter under these circumstances. She tried to speak, but this failed her as well, for her lips wouldn't move. Even her vocal cords seemed paralyzed. "I see you are awake, my dear. How are you feeling?" The sound of the voice came nearer until a face appeared. Art Messon's face loomed over her. Lilla thought it impossible for him to be standing over here. He was confined to a wheelchair. Professor Messon smiled at her. "That's my girl. You are putting things together, aren't you? You are just now realizing that I'm too tall. Unless perhaps I'm standing instead of confined to my wheelchair," he said. She tried to nod, but again her body wouldn't respond. Only her eyes, lungs, and heart seemed to continue to work. "Oh, don't try to move, my dear. I fear you will not be able to move at all. You see, I have injected you with a little concoction I acquired in New Orleans, a potion that renders the body in a vegetative or paralyzed state. The body continues to function, though at a slower rate, close to death, I might add. One of the strange side effects is that the individual can still feel and sometimes have the use of their sight. That is such a frightening prospect, I would say, to be able to see all around you but not be able to move, especially since the person is usually buried after they have been injected. The person is then dug out days later. I can only imagine the horrible mind-altering effect this could cause someone, said Professor Messon. As for you, my dear, well, I won't be burying you in the ground. You can be comforted by that. On the other hand, I think you may suffer a much worse fate. But let me stop, as I am getting ahead of myself. I think I need to start at the beginning in order for you to fully understand your predicament. First of all, you are in an ice house that I have created under the carriage house. I know you're thinking, how or why in the world did he create an ice house in the south? Well, I can assure you it wasn't easy, said the professor. I had to have it dug into the ground and then lined with stones and special oils applied for sealant, being so close to the river. I've had the room dug and ice shipped from the mountains. I also had this cooling system built in here to keep things cold. He motioned to the machine with the big wheel that Lilla had seen to her right. So why all the trouble, you're wondering? Why not settle up north? The professor continued with a flourish, as if he enjoyed explaining and had been just waiting for the chance to tell someone. He looked at her closely. The answer is that, very much like you, I have to keep moving. I have to keep suspicion off me. Oh, yes, I know all about you. You've been a very bad girl. But never mind. Never mind about that. Your history is safe with me. In fact, it is your history that makes you so perfect. Lilla didn't like the sound of that statement. She didn't care much for the professor's mindless babbling either. She just wanted out of here. She didn't take her eyes off him. She studied him, noticed that he looked even younger than she had seen at dinner. And he stood on his own without assistance. Lilla could only assume that the professor must have been faking the whole time. So you're wondering what my point is to all this, the professor continued as he leaned in closer and stroked her hair. It is really a shame it has to be this way. You are so pretty, and maybe we could have been partners. But I think you're planning to kill me. He produced the syringe Lilla had tucked in her bustier, holding it up in his hand in front of her face so she could see. Lilla rolled her eyes, for she couldn't do anything else. Yes, I see, he said. You intended to get on giving me a heart attack. Very ingenious. I wonder, how many husbands have you already done this to? I could trace you to one husband, but I am sure there were others. None of them matters. Now does it? You have come to stay with me until the end. To death do us part, he said with a leering smile. Lilla could only wonder what this crazy man was talking about. She realized that he would kill her. She just didn't know how. Let me tell you a little story before you go into hypothermia, which you very well might do so. I am hundreds of years old. As you might be guessing, I am growing younger before your eyes. This is because of a discovery I stumbled upon when I was a soldier during the Napoleonic War. I discovered the secret of youth. When we invaded Russia, things were very bad, and we found ourselves very cold and hungry. The further we marched back from Russia, the worse things got for us. The air became so cold we found that we could strip meat off horses and eat it raw while the horses still lived. In this way we could keep our meat fresh and close at hand. But my platoon eventually became cut off from the rest of the army, and we were lost for weeks, months maybe. That had been so long ago, I can barely remember now." He reminisced. "Eventually we ran out of horses, and men were dying of starvation and cold. And it came to me one night, as a friend of mine lay shivering in the snow, that humans are meat too. I cut him while he lay sleeping. His skin was so cold he couldn't feel any pain, nor did he bleed very much. The meat nourished me, and I felt more alive than I ever had," he said with passion in his voice and fire in his eyes as he looked at Lilla. "The next morning my friend saw the cut on his leg and bandaged it, not knowing how it happened. The next night I found myself someone else and cut some meat from them, and continued to do this every night without anyone suspecting. I only needed a small amount of human flesh to revive myself, so no one ever caught on to what I was doing. I survived the war in doing this, and through the years discovered the benefits of human flesh. It is the fountain of youth and revitalized nourishment that heals me and brings me to life." Lilla finally understood, and her panic subsided to terror as she realized what he had in store for her. Suddenly she felt sorry for all the bad things she had done, all the men she had killed, and all the women she had made go insane. She wanted to take it all back and ask for forgiveness, but it was too late. Lilla felt a slight pressure on her leg and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, he stood before her. "I promise you won't feel pain, ever. I'm not sure how long you will last in here, until your body can't handle the cold anymore, but I will keep you as comfortable as I can. We will feed your body intravenously, so you won't even have to eat. You won't be able to move, but I will come visit you often." He leaned down and kissed her, and then took a bite of something he held in his hand. Lilla looked closer and saw that he held a piece of meat, fresh, raw meat. She suddenly realized he had cut this meat from her leg as she lay there. Lilla's mind went thoroughly into madness as she watched him eat. And that's the end. And I don't know how long she lasted. We'll never know. I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I hope you've learned a valuable lesson. Not to be like Lilla. Anyway, thank you for listening, and have a very nice evening.